We've got Bridget Quitter with us now, the legal officer for Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. She's the co-author of this report, joining us from Geneva, and we thank you very much for your time. We'll talk about some of those specifics, the things which are being, the treatment of these women, but I was interested in the increase in political targeting of female activists in the first place. Why is that happening?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me here to discuss this very important report. This is something that took both organizations quite a long time to compile because of all of the information and all the data that we were understanding and retrieving. So when it comes to the question of why this new targeting occurred, there was an increase in 2017. In general, there was a crackdown that occurred in Bahrain, widespread across both male and female sectors. However, when Bahrain is typically discussed, it is mostly the male prisoners that people are discussing, the male human rights defenders and the male political prisoners. And what we've seen with the women is perhaps, and this was one of the experts that we interviewed, had sort of an opinion that it's possible that the reason the women were targeted is because in a lot of cultures they're considered the most vulnerable and sometimes the most sacred, and they hold the family honor. So perhaps it's because if you target these women, you're also targeting the men that they're connected to. And that's what we've seen in multiple cases here, is that women were targeted on the basis of relatives that were men who had been more politically active. And so that might be a reason. But in general, across Bahrain, there was a crackdown in 2017, including changes to the counter-terror legislation that allowed for longer periods of pretrial detention, gave back power to the National Security Agency to investigate and make arrests, which had been stripped in 2011-2012 following serious allegations of abuses, and the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry specifically noting that that body should not be involved in arrests and interrogations. And as we've seen, of course, in the report is in 2017, the two women that we had that were sexually assaulted, it was by NSA officers at the Muharraq security complex. So you can see sort of that direct correlation there.
Right. And how do you find out all this information, Bridget? It's obviously not a very open society. It's not the type of stuff that would be talked about there. Is it going in and talking to people who've come out, or going into prisons and talking to them? How does all the information come out?
Sure. In an ideal world, we would have been able to speak to these women in person, face to face. However, access to Bahrain has been essentially cut off to international monitoring and human rights organizations, and even the UN. International human rights organizations have not been able to visit Bahrain since 2015. And the United Nations has repeatedly asked for visits, either from the Office of the High Commissioner or the Special Procedures Offices. Multiple mandates have requested visits, and Bahrain has not allowed a single Special Procedures Office to visit since 2006. So when you're talking about lack of access, that is absolutely a crucial challenge that we had in drafting this report. However, we were able to speak to these women directly and indirectly in some cases. Specifically, it was often through phone calls and voice recordings of phone calls from the prison to the organizations, to their family members, of course with their informed consent as to what this report might mean for them. We also reviewed their court documents and medical reports. Some of the women actually wrote letters that were sort of smuggled out of prison that we were able to obtain as well. But for the most part, we also, so it's a heavy emphasis on these individual interviews that we were able to sort of conduct across multiple months in these like short little phone calls that we were able to receive, as well as a heavy emphasis on obtaining official records and documentation. So we have records from the courts in Bahrain, we have records from the Office of Public Prosecution and their summonses and their indictments that were brought against these women. We have records from the Ministry of Interior Ombudsman and the National Institution of Human Rights, which are meant to be independent human rights monitoring organizations, and they simply aren't. We actually directly engaged with those offices with the consent of these women to file complaints to these offices, and so we have their responses within our own records of how they were handling these abuses, which was essentially dismissing them entirely, sometimes ignoring them, or stating that the women were just trying to make trouble or trying to avoid punishment for their alleged crimes that they were charging them with. So that's sort of the emphasis on documentation that we had.
Bridget, thank you for your time. Glad we could talk about this report with you. Thanks for joining us.